The jet of water exploded with devastating force, slicing through the courtyard air like a liquid spear. The noise was deafening, a constant roar that echoed off the school's concrete walls. The pressure was enough to knock a grown man off his feet in seconds, but Robert Stone remained standing, motionless as a bronze statue. The water hit him square in the chest, drenching his white shirt, turning it into a second skin that revealed the defined muscles beneath. His sneakers were soaked instantly, forming puddles around his feet. Droplets streamed down his dark face, running off his strong jaw and onto the already wet ground. But Robert didn't move. His black eyes remained fixed on his attacker, an absolute calm in his gaze that contrasted violently with the watery chaos around him. Michael Carter held the hose with both hands, a wide grin plastered on his tanned face. At 19, he was known throughout the school as the bully no one dared to challenge. His muscles tensed under his tank top as he controlled the hose, his green eyes shining with satisfaction. Around him, 4 of his friends laughed loudly, some clapping, others recording everything on their phones. The crowd that had formed in the second-floor windows shouted and whistled, waiting to see the new kid fall to his knees, beg for mercy, run away, humiliated. It was always like this. Michael dominated, and everyone else bowed down. But something was wrong. The laughs began to die down one by one, like candles being snuffed out by the wind. The students in the windows stopped shouting. Michael's smile faltered for an instant as Robert took a step forward, walking through the jet of water as if it were just a summer shower. The drenched boy's expression showed no fear, anger, or desperation. There was only a disturbing serenity, as if this was exactly where he was supposed to be, as if everything was happening according to a plan only he knew. It was in that moment, as the water continued to hammer his body without making him flinch, that the entire school realized something crucial. Robert Stone was no ordinary boy. There was something about him, in the way he moved, in the way his eyes assessed everyone around him, in the posture that not even the brutal force of the water could break. For the first time in years, Michael felt something he had forgotten. A chill ran down his spine. He was about to discover that he had chosen the wrong person to humiliate. But this story didn't begin there, in that soaked courtyard. To understand how Robert Stone arrived at that moment, you have to go back a few hours, to when the day was still just a promise of conflict, not a certainty. The morning had begun with the sun rising over the south side of Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange that contrasted with the city's gray concrete. Northwood High School stood, imposingly on Oakwood Boulevard, a 4-story building with bars on its windows and iron gates that separated the students from the outside world. It was a Monday, the kind of day when anything seemed possible and nothing seemed particularly threatening. Robert Stone got off the bus 2 blocks before the school. He preferred to walk, to use that time to observe, to assess, to mentally prepare for what was to come. At 18, he was 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a posture that drew attention, even when he was trying to go unnoticed. His skin was dark, his hair cut close to his scalp. He wore dark jeans, simple black sneakers, and a white shirt that further highlighted his skin tone. He carried only a canvas backpack, light and discreet. As he walked toward the school gate, Robert observed everything. The way students clustered in small circles in the yard, the invisible hierarchy that determined who stood near the main entrance and who was pushed to the sides, the faces that showed confidence and those that revealed fear. He had learned long ago that first impressions were rarely accurate, but they were always revealing. People showed who they were in the first 5 minutes, even when they were trying to hide it. It was as he passed through the gate that Robert saw him for the first time. Michael Carter was leaning against the wall near the main office, surrounded by his friends like a king by his courtiers. He was laughing loudly at something one of the boys had said, his head thrown back, his white teeth flashing in the sun. He wore beige cargo pants and a black tank top that showed off his muscular arms. He had light brown hair, deliberately messy, a square jaw, and eyes that scanned the yard as if everything in it belonged to him. When Robert walked past, Michael stopped laughing, his green eyes fixed on the newcomer, narrowing slightly. There was a moment of mutual assessment, 2 predators recognizing each other in disputed territory. Robert didn't look away, But he didn't hold the gaze for too long either. He simply kept walking, his stride steady and confident, as if Michael were just another temporary obstacle in his path. One of Michael's friends, a red-haired boy with freckles named Luke, stepped forward. Robert was about to discover that the boy had an annoying habit of speaking without thinking. Luke shouted something about the new kid thinking he was better than everyone, about walking around like he owned the place. His voice had that high-pitched tone of someone who needs others' approval to feel important. Robert heard every word but didn't respond. He kept walking, climbing the steps to the main entrance without a glance back. Michael watched with growing interest. Most new kids got nervous when he or his friends noticed them. They would stammer, look away, quicken their pace. This guy had simply ignored Luke as if he didn't exist. That was new, that was interesting, that was disrespectful. Michael smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found a new project, a new target, a new form of entertainment. In the second-floor hallway, Robert located the senior classroom he had been transferred to. The door was open, and a few students were already in their seats. He walked in unceremoniously, choosing a spot in the back, near the window. He liked being able to see what was happening both inside and outside the room. It was a matter of always having escape routes, of never being cornered. Old habits of someone who learned to be cautious from a young age. A girl with curly hair and red-rimmed glasses sat down next to him. She introduced herself as Julia, spoke quickly about the teachers, about how the school worked, about the cliques that existed and the people it was best to avoid. Robert thanked her politely, responding with monosyllables when necessary, but not encouraging further conversation. Julia got the message and turned her attention back to her notebook, but Robert noticed she kept casting curious glances in his direction. It was when the bell rang that Michael entered the classroom. He wasn't alone. 3 of his friends followed him, including Luke, the redhead who had shouted in the yard. They moved like a pack, occupying the desks in the middle of the room with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Michael scanned the room with his eyes until he found him. When their gazes met, Michael gave a nod, a gesture that might seem friendly to a casual observer, but which Robert recognized for what it truly was, a marking of territory, a warning, a promise that this was just the beginning. The math teacher, a middle-aged man named Mr. Davies, rushed in, his arms full of books and papers. He welcomed the new student without much fanfare, asking Robert to introduce himself briefly. Robert stood up, said his name, mentioned he came from another school on the east side, and sat back down. His voice was deep and controlled, his words chosen carefully. He gave no unnecessary information, didn't try to impress anyone, didn't play the victim or the hero. He was just a new kid in a new school, nothing more. But everyone in the room sensed there was more. The way he moved had an economy of motion that suggested training. The way his eyes kept scanning the room even while the teacher spoke indicated constant vigilance. And above all, there was that calm. It wasn't the calm of someone who had nothing to fear, but the calm of someone who had already faced his fears and come out the other side, transformed. During class, Michael passed a note to Luke. Robert couldn't read the contents, but he saw the reaction. Luke laughed out loud, earning a warning look from the teacher, then turned to look directly at Robert. The message was clear. Whatever was on that paper, it was about the new kid. The game had begun, and Robert knew exactly how it would end. When math class ended, Robert remained seated while the other students left in noisy groups. He calmly organized his materials, putting his notebook and pen in his backpack with precise movements. There was no rush. Rushing was what people expected, what turned someone into prey. Robert had learned long ago that the predator never runs. The predator walks with purpose, observes, waits for the right moment. Julia was still beside him, gathering her own things. She turned to him with a hesitant smile, her brown eyes filled with poorly disguised concern. Robert realized she wanted to say something, but was weighing her words. Finally, she made up her mind. Her voice came out low, almost a whisper, as if she were afraid someone might hear her even with the room nearly empty. Julia spoke about Michael Carter. She said he had been at the school since freshman year, that he came from a wealthy family, that his father owned a luxury car dealership in the area. She said Michael had failed a grade once, Not from lack of ability, but from pure rebellion. That he liked to dominate, to make others bow, to constantly prove he was in control. She mentioned there had been trouble in the past, students who had transferred after confrontations with him, parents who had complained but never got anywhere because the Carter family made generous donations to the school. Robert listened to everything without interrupting. When Julia finished, he simply thanked her for the information. She asked if he wasn't worried, if he didn't think it was better to try to avoid Michael for the next few days to let things cool down. Robert replied that he appreciated her concern, but that he didn't run from difficult situations. His voice was soft, but there was a firmness to it that left no room for argument. Julia sighed, wished him good luck, and left the room, casting one last worried glance over her shoulder. Robert stood up and walked toward the door. The second-floor hallway was a river of students flowing toward their next classes. The noise was immense, a cacophony of conversations, laughter, footsteps, and the creak of locker doors being opened and closed. Robert merged into the flow, maintaining his steady pace, his eyes always moving, cataloguing faces, identifying potential problems before they materialized. It was when he was halfway down the hall that he noticed the blockade. Michael and his friends had positioned themselves strategically near the water fountains, forming a human barrier that forced other students to go around. Most did so automatically, some with restrained annoyance, others with obvious fear. Robert saw the trap, recognized the tactic. It was primitive but effective. It was a declaration of power, a way to force the acknowledgement of a hierarchy. He kept walking. He didn't speed up, didn't swerve, didn't show any sign that he had noticed the deliberate obstruction. His steps remained measured, his expression neutral. When he was just a few feet away, Luke stepped forward, completely blocking Robert's path. Michael's other friends did the same, forming a solid line of bodies. Michael stood in the center, arms crossed over his broad chest, that arrogant smile playing on his lips. Robert stopped a yard away. There was no irritation on his face, no obvious defiance. He simply waited as if he had all the time in the world, as if this were just a minor inconvenience. Michael let the silence stretch for a few seconds, savoring the moment, giving time for other students to notice the confrontation and gather to watch. When he had a sufficient audience, he finally spoke. Michael asked if Robert thought he owned the place. His voice was loud enough for everyone around to hear, laced with a mocking tone that drew nervous laughter from some onlookers. He said that at Northwood High things worked a certain way, that there was an order, and that new kids needed to learn their place before they started walking around like they were important. Michael's friends grumbled in agreement, some smacking their fists into their palms in a not-so-subtle gesture of intimidation. Robert let Michael finish before responding. When he did, his voice was calm and low, forcing people to lean in to hear. He said he didn't think he owned anything, that he was just trying to get to his next class, and that if the hallway was Michael's territory, maybe he should move through it better instead of standing in the middle of it. It was a logical, almost reasonable response, but there was a hidden barb in it that Michael felt like a slap in the face. Michael's green eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, invading Robert's personal space. Their faces were inches apart now. Michael was slightly shorter, which meant he had to look up slightly to meet Robert's gaze. This seemed to irritate him even more. He placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to send a clear message. It was a shove disguised as a friendly gesture, an act of aggression that could be denied if a teacher asked. Robert didn't move. His body absorbed the push like a rock, absorbs a wave without yielding an inch. His feet remained planted on the floor. His posture didn't change. His eyes never left Michael's face. It was as if the push simply hadn't happened, as if Michael didn't have enough strength to affect his frame. This drew murmurs from the crowd that had formed around them. Some students pulled out their phones, starting to record. This would go viral on the school's social media within minutes. Michael felt humiliation burn in his veins. He had pushed the new kid in front of everyone, and the guy hadn't even flinched. Worse, he hadn't reacted with anger or fear. There was just that infuriating calm, those eyes that seemed to see right through him, that seemed to assess and find him wanting. Michael decided to escalate. He asked if Robert thought he was brave, if he thought he could ignore him, if he thought that's how things worked in the real world. Robert answered with a question of his own. He asked if Michael knew the difference between courage and the absence of fear. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the continuation. Robert explained that courage was acting in spite of fear, while the absence of fear was simply having nothing to fear. He said that he personally was not afraid of Michael, which meant he didn't need courage to be there. It was a philosophical distinction that many around them didn't fully grasp, but which Michael understood perfectly as the insult it was. Michael's cheeks turned red. Luke placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him, but Michael shook it off violently. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white with the pressure. Robert noticed the shift in his posture, the way Michael transferred his weight to his front leg, preparing to strike. It was a gesture Robert recognized well. He had seen it before many times inside and outside the ring. It was the moment when rage overrode reason, when someone was about to do something stupid. That's when the bell rang, shrill and insistent. The sound shattered the tension like a hammer shattering glass. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, students pushed toward their next classes by the inevitable force of the school routine. Teachers started appearing at classroom doors, yelling for everyone to get inside. Michael stood there for another moment, his eyes still locked on Robert, his breathing heavy and ragged. Luke pulled Michael by the arm, insisting they had to go. Michael finally relented, but not before whispering something to Robert, his words laced with venom. He said this wasn't over, that they had a whole afternoon to settle things, that the new kid was going to find out how things really worked there. Robert didn't reply. He simply watched Michael walk away, noting the stiffness in his back, the way his friends had to practically drag him along. When the hallway finally cleared, Robert continued his walk to the next class. His steps were the same as before. His face showed no emotion, but inside him something had ignited. It wasn't anger or fear, it was recognition. Michael Carter wasn't going to stop. This was going to escalate. And at some point that day, probably very soon, things would move from words to action. Robert knew how these situations developed. He had far too much experience with bullies, with people who confused brute force with real power. The difference was that this time, Michael had picked the wrong person. Robert Stone was not like the other students who had been intimidated before. He had training, discipline, and above all, control. And when the moment came, when Michael finally crossed the line that separated empty threats from real action, Robert would be ready. Because while Michael spent his days intimidating weaker people, Robert spent his afternoons at the gym, learning to turn his body into a controlled and precise weapon. Michael didn't know that yet, but he would soon find out. The lunch break arrived with the sun high in the sky, turning Northwood High's cafeteria into a stuffy oven, despite the fans that spun lazily from the high ceiling. The space was large, capable of holding about 200 students at once, with blue plastic tables arranged in neat rows and a self-service counter at the back where the kitchen staff served the day's lunch. The smell of rice, beans, and grilled steak hung in the air, mingling with the clatter of cutlery on plates and the constant murmur of dozens of simultaneous conversations. Robert entered the cafeteria, carrying only a bottle of water. He had brought his own lunch from home, a habit he'd kept since he was a child. He preferred to know exactly what he was eating to control his nutrition, to maintain discipline even in small things. He chose an empty table in the farthest corner, near a window that overlooked the inner courtyard. It was a strategic position, with a clear view of all entrances and exits, with the wall at his back and open space in front of him. He opened his backpack and took out a plastic container holding grilled chicken breast, sweet potato, and broccoli. It was a simple but nutritious meal, calculated to provide the energy needed for his afternoon training. Robert ate slowly, chewing each bite completely, savoring it not for pleasure but for mindfulness. Every forkful was a deliberate act, every movement controlled. He didn't look at his phone, didn't get distracted by others' conversations. He was present in the moment, aware of his surroundings, even as he seemed completely focused on his meal. A few tables in front of him, Michael and his friends occupied a large rectangular table in the center of the cafeteria. It was the best spot, naturally. It always was. They laughed loudly, made jokes, threw pieces of bread at each other. Luke was telling some story with exaggerated gestures that made everyone laugh. But Michael wasn't laughing. His green eyes were fixed on Robert, studying him with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This new kid was really starting to get on his nerves. All morning, since the incident in the hallway, Michael couldn't stop thinking about him. The way Robert had remained motionless when pushed, the way his words, though calm, contained sharp barbs that cut deep, the complete absence of the fear or respect that should have been there. Michael was used to reactions: fear, anger, open defiance, even admiration. But indifference, that disturbing calm, that was new, and Michael hated new things he couldn't control. Philip, one of Michael's friends, a skinny kid with bleached blonde hair and a nose ring, followed Michael's gaze to Robert. He commented on the new kid eating alone, on how weird it was for someone to be so isolated on their first day. Luke laughed, saying Robert probably thought he was better than everyone, which was why he didn't mix. Michael said nothing, but he kept watching. His fingers drummed an irregular rhythm on the table, a sign he was planning something. It was then that Michael had an idea. He picked up his plate, still holding a generous portion of mashed potatoes, and stood up. His friends immediately realized what he was about to do, and their smiles widened. This was going to be fun. This would put the new kid in his place. Philip and Luke followed him, forming a small entourage as Michael walked toward Robert's table with exaggeratedly casual steps. Robert saw them approaching without lifting his head. He continued eating, but his posture shifted subtly. His shoulders tensed slightly, his muscles readied themselves. His brain began calculating angles and distances. He didn't look directly at Michael, but he was perfectly aware of every step, every movement. When Michael was just a few feet from the table, Robert finally raised his eyes, meeting the other's gaze with that same calm that so irritated him. Michael stopped beside the table, the plate in one hand. He commented on Robert eating alone, on how sad that must be, on how maybe he should try to be more social. His voice had that tone of false concern that barely hid the underlying mockery. Robert replied politely that he preferred the quiet, that there was nothing wrong with eating alone. Michael pretended to consider this, nodding as if pondering something profound. That's when it happened. Michael took a step forward, seemingly losing his balance, and his plate tilted dangerously. The mashed potatoes slid off the plate and landed directly on the right sleeve of Robert's white shirt, a yellowish, sticky stain that spread across the fabric. The nearby tables erupted in laughter. Some students pointed, others covered their mouths, trying to stifle their giggles. Luke clapped, as if he had just watched a particularly good performance. Michael apologized with theatrical exaggeration, saying it was an accident, that he was so clumsy sometimes. He offered paper napkins with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Robert looked at the soiled sleeve, then at Michael, then back at the sleeve. There was a moment of tense silence where everyone waited for the reaction. Some students backed away slightly, anticipating a confrontation. Others leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single detail. Robert simply took one of the offered napkins and began to clean his sleeve with calm, methodical movements. There was no anger on his face, no humiliation. It was as if this were just another minor inconvenience, something that could be fixed with a little soap and water later. When he had cleaned what he could, Robert looked at Michael and commented that he should work on his balance. He said that carrying a plate shouldn't be that difficult, that maybe he needed better motor coordination. The cafeteria fell silent. The laughter died abruptly. It was a completely unexpected response. Robert had turned what should have been a humiliation into constructive criticism, had stripped all the power from Michael's act by refusing to acknowledge it as an aggression. It was brilliant and infuriating in equal measure. Philip let out a nervous laugh before he could stop himself, earning a glare from Michael. Michael sat down in the chair opposite Robert, uninvited. Luke and Philip stood behind him like bodyguards. Michael asked if Robert always ate alone at his old school, too. Robert replied that he did, when he felt like it. Michael pressed, asking if Robert didn't have any friends if nobody liked him. Robert placed his fork on his plate with a soft click and finally gave Michael his full attention. Robert said he preferred peace to the company of people who wasted words. He said that empty conversations bored him, that constant noise was just a distraction. and that he had learned long ago to choose carefully who he spent his time with. It was an answer that could be interpreted in several ways, but Michael understood the message perfectly. He was being categorized as someone not worth Robert's time, as unnecessary noise, as an unwanted distraction. Michael's face turned red, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Luke put a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him, but Michael was beyond reason. He leaned across the table, invading Robert's space, his voice low and laced with threat. He said Robert was going to regret being so arrogant, that this was just the beginning, that by the end of the day the new kid would find out what happens to people who don't respect the order of things. Just then, Mr. Davies walked past the table, carrying his own lunch tray. He sensed the tension immediately, his experienced eyes recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation. He stopped beside the table and asked if there was a problem. Michael immediately adjusted his posture, his face taking on a look of studied innocence. He said there was no problem at all, that they were just talking, getting to know their new classmate. Mr. Davies didn't seem convinced, but he had no proof of anything. He looked at Robert, who confirmed with a nod that everything was fine. The teacher warned that he wouldn't tolerate any kind of trouble in his school, that everyone should behave in a civilized manner, and then continued to his own table. But before he was completely out of earshot, he looked directly at Michael and said that some students needed to remember that strength was not synonymous with character. Michael stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a finger at Robert and whispered that this wasn't over, that the new kid had won this round, but the game was just beginning. Robert didn't respond. He simply went back to eating his meal as if Michael had already left, as if he were as relevant as the air. And it was this indifference, more than any word or action, that finally made Michael lose control of his anger. The afternoon classes dragged on with torturous slowness. Robert sat at his desk, seemingly focused on the teachers and the lessons, but his attention was divided. He could feel Michael's constant glares burning into his back, could hear the whispers circulating through the classroom, could sense the tension building in the air like electricity before a storm. Everyone knew something was going to happen. It was just a matter of when and where. During history class, Ms. Martin, a 50-year-old woman with grey hair pulled into a tight bun, was trying to explain something about the American Revolution, but no one was really paying attention. The students whispered among themselves, exchanged texts on phones hidden under their desks, and cast furtive glances between Robert and Michael, as if watching a movie and waiting for the climax. The teacher noticed the distraction, sighed heavily, and continued her lesson with less enthusiasm, knowing she had lost the battle for her students' attention. Michael spent the entire class scribbling something in his notebook. Luke, sitting next to him, would occasionally look over his shoulder, chuckling at something he saw. Robert didn't need to see it to know it was probably about him. Maybe drawings, maybe written insults, maybe plans for what was to come, it didn't matter. Robert had dealt with bullies his whole life. Some were creative in their intimidation, others were brutally direct. Michael seemed to be the type who liked to build tension, to make his victims suffer in anticipation before the real blow. When the final bell of the day finally rang, releasing the students, there was a chaotic rush for the doors. But this time, instead of the usual dispersal of students leaving quickly, many remained in the hallways. Groups formed near the lockers. Younger students whispered among themselves. Some already had their phones out, ready to record. The word had spread. Michael Carter was going to confront the new kid after class. No one wanted to miss it. Robert packed his things with his usual calm. Julia, who had been silent all afternoon, finally found the courage to speak. She leaned toward him and whispered urgently that he should use the back exit, that he could avoid Michael for today, that maybe things would be calmer tomorrow. Robert thanked her again for her concern, but said he didn't run from things. Julia looked at him with a mixture of admiration and pity, as if she were looking at someone who had deliberately chosen to walk into a lion's den. When Robert left the classroom, he found Michael waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall opposite the door. He wasn't alone. Luke, Philip, and 2 other friends formed a semicircle around him. Other students lined the sides of the hall, creating a sort of makeshift arena. There was something primitive about it, like ancient tribes gathering to watch a duel. Robert noticed that some teachers were still in their rooms, but none seemed willing to intervene yet. Maybe they thought the boys were just going to talk. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. Michael pushed himself off the wall when he saw Robert. He walked to the center of the hallway, forcing Robert to stop if he wanted to pass. There was something different in his eyes now. The anger from the cafeteria had solidified into something colder, more calculated. He had spent the last few hours planning this moment, imagining what he would say, how he would finally break the mask of calm that Robert wore like armor. Michael began by saying he'd given Robert enough time to learn how things worked. He said he'd been patient, that he'd given him chances, but apparently the new kid was too stupid to understand subtle messages. His voice echoed in the hallway, projected so everyone could hear. It was a performance as much as a confrontation. Michael needed an audience, needed witnesses to his domination. Robert responded with a question. He asked what, exactly, Michael thought he should have learned. His voice was low, forcing Michael to step closer to hear, closing the distance between them. Michael said Robert should have learned respect, should have learned his place, should have learned that in a school there were kings and there were subjects, and that new kids were definitely subjects until they proved otherwise. Robert considered that, for a moment. Then he asked how exactly one proved otherwise. Michael smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who finally had his prey where he wanted him. He said, "You proved it by fighting for a place in the hierarchy, by facing challenges, by showing strength." Robert nodded slowly as if absorbing a valuable lesson. Then he made an observation that cut through Michael's bravado like a sharp blade. Robert said that hierarchies based on physical strength were the most fragile of all, that there was always someone stronger, always someone who could knock the king off his throne. That power based on intimidation was temporary, that respect earned through fear wasn't real respect. He said Michael was confusing submission with respect, and that anyone who needed to use force to be heard had already lost the argument before it even began. The hallway fell completely silent. Even Michael's friends seemed paralyzed by the audacity of Robert's words. No one talked to Michael Carter like that. No one questioned his authority so directly, so calmly, so publicly. It was social suicide. It was an open challenge. It was a declaration of war. Michael stepped forward, completely invading Robert's personal space. Their breaths mingled in the air between them. Michael was trembling, not with fear, but with pure, unfiltered rage. He said through gritted teeth that Robert didn't know anything, that he talked a lot for someone who was about to learn a painful lesson. He said that pretty words meant nothing when you were on the ground bleeding, when you were humiliated in front of everyone, when you were begging for mercy. Robert didn't back down an inch. He held eye contact, his black eyes meeting Michael's green ones without blinking. When he replied, his voice had an almost educational quality, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a student who was struggling to understand. Robert said that Michael was making a fundamental mistake, that he was assuming Robert had something to prove, that he cared about the opinions of the other students, that he valued a place in some high school hierarchy. Robert continued, explaining that he wasn't there to challenge Michael, wasn't there to take his place, wasn't there to create a new kingdom with himself at the top. He said he simply wanted to go to school, learn, and leave. That Michael was the one who had turned this into a competition, who had decided that Robert's existence was somehow a threat. Robert said that Michael wasn't testing him. He was testing himself. He was fighting his own insecurities projected onto a stranger who had never done anything to him. It was basic psychology but devastatingly accurate. Michael felt as if he had been stripped naked in public, as if all his fears and weaknesses had been exposed for everyone to see. Worse, he knew Robert was right. There was no logical reason for his hatred of the new kid other than the fact that Robert represented something Michael couldn't control, something that wouldn't bow, something that existed completely independent of his approval or disapproval. Luke tried to intervene, saying Robert was just all talk, that words didn't change anything. But Michael silenced him with a sharp gesture. His eyes never left Robert's. Something was happening there, something deeper than just a school fight. Michael was being forced to look at himself through Robert's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. Robert took a step to the side, signaling his intention to pass. He said this conversation had been interesting, but he had to leave. He had commitments, he had training. Michael stood frozen for a moment, processing, deciding. There was a part of him that wanted to let Robert go, that wanted to reconsider this whole situation. But there was a larger part, a part fueled by years of being the bully, of being the king, of never being challenged, that couldn't let it go. Michael blocked Robert's path again. He said they weren't done, that they wouldn't be done, until Robert learned his lesson. Robert sighed, a small sound of genuine weariness. He asked what exactly Michael wanted from him. A fight, an apology, public submission? Michael didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know exactly what he wanted. He just knew he needed to break Robert's calm, needed to see fear in his eyes, needed to re-establish the natural order of things. That's when another bell rang. The warning that the school was closing, that everyone needed to leave. Teachers started appearing at their classroom doors, shouting for students to go home. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, robbing Michael of his audience. He looked around, seeing his moment slip through his fingers. He couldn't do anything now, not with teachers watching, but there was time. There would be another opportunity, and this time he would make sure there were no interruptions, no escape for the arrogant new kid. Michael watched Robert walk away down the hall with that same measured gait, that same confident posture that had irritated him from the first moment. Rage boiled in his veins, but it was now accompanied by something more dangerous, more calculated, determination. He had been challenged, questioned, analyzed, and exposed in front of everyone. This could not stand. There had to be a resolution, a final definitive demonstration of who ran this school. Luke sidled up, his voice low and conspiratorial. He suggested they wait for Robert in the parking lot, that they get him as he was leaving school. Philip disagreed, saying the parking lot had security cameras, that it would be stupid to do something where they could be identified. Michael's other friends gathered around, offering suggestions, each more impractical than the last. Michael silenced them with a sharp gesture. It was then that he remembered the back courtyard. It was a rarely used area located at the rear of the school, near the maintenance supply sheds. Students often used it as a shortcut to the back exit, which led directly to the parallel street. There were no cameras in that area, teachers rarely patrolled there after school, and it was secluded enough that no one would interrupt them. It was perfect. Michael explained his plan in a low voice to his friends. They would wait for Robert in the back courtyard. But this time, it wouldn't be just talk or shoves. This time, Michael wanted to do something memorable, something that would be filmed and shared throughout the school, something that would put the new kid in his place once and for all. Luke smiled, already imagining the possibilities. That's when he noticed the fire hose. The hose was hanging on the hallway wall near the back courtyard. One of those old red hoses in a glass cabinet inscribed in case of emergency. Luke had a brilliant, cruel idea. What if they used the hose on the new kid? The water pressure would be strong enough to knock him down, to drench him completely, to make him look ridiculous and helpless. It would be the perfect video, the ultimate humiliation. Michael considered the idea for a moment, and then smiled. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of thing that would finally break Robert's mask of calm. The 5 boys moved quickly. Philip stood watch in the main hall, pretending to be at his locker while he watched for any approaching teachers. Luke worked on opening the hose cabinet, using a coin to force the simple lock. Michael and the other 2, a heavy-set boy named Theo and another tall, thin one named Bruno, checked the back courtyard, making sure it was empty and that the main water valve was accessible. The cabinet opened with a satisfying click. Luke pulled out the hose, uncoiling it as he walked toward the courtyard. It was surprisingly heavy, the thick fabric rough in his hands. Theo connected the end to the main valve, testing the connection to make sure it was secure. Bruno was in charge of the valve, ready to open it, when Michael gave the signal. It was a miniature military operation, each with his role, all working toward the same goal. Michael positioned himself in the center of the courtyard, holding the nozzle of the hose with both hands. The excitement was palpable among them. Luke already had his phone out, ready to film. This would be the video that defined the rest of the school year. This would be the moment Michael Carter reasserted his absolute dominance over Northwood High, and Robert Stone, the arrogant new kid who thought he was better than everyone, would be the unwilling star of the show. Meanwhile, Robert finished putting his books in the locker that had been assigned to him that morning. He checked his phone quickly, seeing a text from his coach confirming the time for that afternoon's training. Robert replied briefly, confirming he would be there as always. Boxing was a fundamental part of his life, the discipline that kept him centered, that channeled his energy into something productive instead of destructive. It was where he learned control, not just of his body, but of his mind and emotions. Robert closed his locker and started walking toward the exit. He could have taken the main exit, where there were still a few students lingering, where there were teachers and staff. But Robert liked the back route. It was quieter, more direct, and it gave him time to process the day, to mentally prepare for the training to come. Besides, he didn't avoid difficult situations. If Michael was planning something, it was better to face it now than to postpone the inevitable. When Robert turned the corner toward the back courtyard, he saw the group immediately. Michael in the center holding the hose, Luke with his phone raised, the others spread out in a strategic formation. It was too obvious, transparent in its intent. Robert paused for a moment, assessing the situation. He could turn back, take another route. No one would blame him for avoiding an obvious ambush. But that wasn't how Robert operated. He continued walking directly toward them. His steps were firm, his gaze fixed on Michael. When he was about 15 feet away, Robert stopped. He slowly took off his backpack and placed it carefully on the ground, far enough away that it wouldn't be damaged by what was about to happen. Then he straightened up, his arms loose at his sides, and looked directly at Michael. Robert's voice cut through the courtyard air, calm, but with a weight that hadn't been there before. He said only 6 words, but they carried a warning that any sensible person would have understood. Be careful what you start. It wasn't a threat. It was a piece of advice, given with the same serenity as someone warning about a wet floor or a poorly closed door. It was Michael's last chance to reconsider, to step back, to choose a different path. Michael didn't reconsider. He had come too far to turn back now. His pride, his reputation, his entire identity was invested in this moment. He looked at Bruno and yelled the order that would change everything. "Open the valve." Bruno didn't hesitate. His fingers turned the red wheel, counterclockwise. There was a second of silence, a final moment of peace before the storm. Then the water exploded from the hose with brutal force. The jet hit Robert square in the chest, the pressure so intense it could have torn the skin off someone unprepared. Robert's white shirt was instantly transparent, plastered to his body like a second skin. Water ricocheted off him, creating a spray that soaked everything around. His sneakers were drenched in seconds, his hair matted to his skull. But Robert didn't fall. He didn't even sway. His feet remained firmly planted on the concrete, his knees slightly bent to absorb the impact, his boxer's stance keeping him stable against the force trying to knock him down. Michael kept the jet focused on Robert, waiting to see him fall, to see him try to cover his face, to see him run. But none of that happened. Robert remained exactly where he was, his eyes never leaving Michael's face, and it was in that moment, with the water hammering his body, that Robert made a decision. Enough. He had been patient, had tried to avoid conflict, had given Michael every opportunity to back down. But some people only learned one way, and Robert was about to teach a lesson that Michael would never forget. The laughter that had started when the water first hit Robert began to die down. The students who had gathered at the windows to watch the show stopped shouting. Even Michael's friends fell silent, watching with growing unease as Robert simply stood there, motionless, drenched, but somehow more menacing than ever. There was something in the way he absorbed the punishment without reacting, in the absolute calm of his face as the water tried to topple him. That was deeply unsettling. Robert took a step forward, then another. He walked directly through the jet of water, cutting through it as if it were just a light rain. Each step was deliberate, calculated, unstoppable. For the first time, Michael felt a real chill in his spine, a genuine doubt about whether he had made the right decision. He increased the pressure on the hose, trying to use all the available force, but Robert kept advancing. When Robert was just a yard away, he did something no one expected. In a movement so fast it was barely perceptible, he executed a precise and controlled side kick. His foot connected with the side of the hose's nozzle, exactly where the pressure was directed. The impact of the kick was perfectly calculated, with enough force to change the direction of the jet, but not to damage the equipment. The result was instantaneous and dramatic. The hose jumped out of Michael's hands like a living snake. The jet of water shifted direction abruptly, now pointing directly at Michael, hitting him square in the face. The chaos that followed was instant and absolute. Michael threw his hands up to his face, trying to shield himself from the jet of water that now hit him with the same brutal force that had been directed at Robert moments before. The pressure was so intense that he staggered backward, his feet slipping on the now wet concrete. Luke let out a cry of surprise, his phone nearly falling from his hands as he tried to process what had just happened. The hose was now completely out of control, snaking across the courtyard floor like a living, angry creature. Theo, in a panic, tried to grab the hose to redirect it, but the force of the water was too much. As soon as his fingers touched the wet fabric, the hose twisted violently in his hands, the jet changing direction and hitting him directly in the stomach. The heavy-set boy didn't have Robert's stability. The impact knocked him down like a bowling pin, his arms flailing as he fell backward into a growing puddle. The thud echoed through the courtyard, followed by a groan of pain and humiliation. Bruno, who was at the valve, froze. His wide eyes darted between the soaked Michael, Theo on the ground, the out-of-control hose, and Robert, who stood in the center of the chaos like the calm eye of a hurricane. Bruno knew he should close the valve, but his hands seemed to have forgotten how to work. The shock of what was happening had paralyzed his reflexes. Philip, who had run into the courtyard upon hearing the commotion, slipped on the water and collided with Bruno, both of them falling in a tangle of limbs. Robert watched it all for a moment, his expression still perfectly serene, despite being soaked from head to toe. Then, with the same deliberate calm that had characterized all his movements since arriving at the school that morning, he advanced toward the hose. His steps were firm even on the slippery ground, his balance perfect even with water ricocheting around him. He bent down, grabbed the hose with one hand, and with the other reached for the regulating valve near the nozzle. With one precise movement, Robert shut off the valve. The roar of the water gradually subsided to a trickle, then silence. The courtyard fell completely silent, broken only by the sound of water dripping from drenched clothes and Michael's heavy breathing. Everyone was wet now, everyone was on the ground or trying to get up, everyone except Robert, who remained, standing holding the deactivated hose in his hands, like a symbol of reclaimed control. Michael spat out water, wiped his face with trembling hands, and looked at Robert with a mixture of shock, anger, and something he had never felt before when looking at another student, genuine fear. His clothes were completely soaked, his normally styled hair was now plastered to his forehead, his dignity was on the ground along with his friends. Worse, he knew it had all been filmed. Luke was still holding his phone, though now pointed at the ground, the recording continuing to capture every second of this humiliation. That's when something inside Michael broke. Maybe it was his wounded pride, maybe it was the accumulated anger of a day spent being challenged, maybe it was simply the inability to accept that he had lost control of the situation. But something fundamental in his psyche snapped, and he stopped thinking rationally. With a cry that was half rage and half desperation, Michael launched himself at Robert, his right fist flying toward the other boy's face. To any casual observer, Michael's punch looked fast and powerful, but to Robert, who had spent the last 5 years training at Master Oswald's gym on the east side, who had competed in dozens of amateur bouts, who had learned to read body movements before they were even complete, Michael's punch was telegraphed, obvious, and easily avoidable. Robert simply moved his head a few inches to the left. Michael's fist sailed through the space where his face had been a second before, meeting only air. The momentum of the missed punch carried Michael forward, unbalancing him. Robert seized that moment of vulnerability. He was no longer just defending himself. Now he was responding, and his response would come with all the precision and control that years of rigorous training had taught him. Robert pivoted his hips, using the momentum of Michael's own movement against him, and delivered a controlled elbow strike to the bully's shoulder. It wasn't a blow meant to cause serious damage, but rather to teach a lesson in efficiency and technique. Michael cried out in pain, more surprised than truly hurt, and spun to face Robert again. This time, he attacked with a flurry of wild punches, no technique, just raw anger turned into motion. Left, right, left again, each punch meant to demolish, to destroy, to punish. But none of them found their target. Robert moved like water, flowing around the attacks, his footwork like a dance, his body bobbing and weaving between the flying fists with an ease that was almost supernatural. And then Robert countered. It wasn't an explosion of violence, but a clinical demonstration of skill, a quick jab that connected with Michael's sternum, knocking the wind out of him, a hook to the body that made his knees buckle, a controlled uppercut that stopped inches from his chin, a warning of what Robert could do if he really wanted to cause harm. Every strike was precise, every movement was economical, every technique was perfect. It was the difference between someone who brawls and someone who fights, between brute force and refined skill. Luke and the others tried to help. They got to their feet, still wet and shaky, and advanced on Robert, trying to surround him, trying to use numbers to their advantage. Robert saw them approaching in his peripheral vision. He didn't panic, didn't speed up his movements. Instead, he simply adjusted his position, putting Michael between himself and the others. When Luke tried to grab him from behind, Robert executed a spinning back kick that was more a warning than an actual attack. His heel passed so close to Luke's face that the boy felt the displaced air, causing him to flinch back instinctively. Philip was next, trying to take Robert down with a low tackle. Robert planted one foot firmly on the ground and brought his knee up at the exact right moment, connecting with Philip's shoulder and changing his trajectory. Philip collided with Theo, who was still trying to get up, and both of them went down again in a heap of limbs. Bruno, seeing the fate of his friends, simply froze, his hands raised in an undeclared surrender. He wanted no part of this. None of them did anymore. Michael, breathing heavily, his body aching in places he didn't know could ache, tried one last desperate attack, but his movements were now slow, uncoordinated, broken. Robert blocked it easily, then grabbed Michael's wrist and used his own momentum to spin him and push him against the wall. It wasn't violent, it wasn't excessive, it was just enough to immobilize him, to end the confrontation without causing unnecessary damage. Robert held Michael against the wall for a moment, letting the message sink in, and then released him, stepping back. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert stood in the center of the courtyard, his breathing controlled, not even winded despite having just faced 5 people. His white shirt, now transparent from the water, revealed the defined muscles of someone who treated his body as a tool to be kept in perfect condition. His eyes swept over the defeated group, Michael leaning against the wall trying to catch his breath, his friends scattered on the wet ground like discarded dolls. Robert looked directly at Michael and asked the question that would echo through the school for months to come. "Are you done?" His voice was calm, almost gentle, with no trace of mockery or cruelty. It was a genuine question, a final offer of peace. Michael didn't answer right away. He looked at his defeated friends, at the soaked courtyard, at the shocked faces of the students watching from the windows. He looked at his own trembling hands, at his shattered pride. And finally, for the first time since Robert Stone had walked into Northwood High, Michael Carter understood that there were limits to his power, that there were people who could not be bullied, that there was a fundamental difference between strength and control. Robert didn't wait for a verbal answer. He offered his hand to Michael, a gesture of reconciliation that took everyone by surprise. Michael stared at the outstretched hand as if it were a venomous snake. To accept it would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that everything he had built his identity on was wrong. But it was also a door being offered, a chance to grow, to learn, to become something more than just a high school bully. Hesitantly, Michael reached out his own hand and took it. Robert helped him to his feet, then turned to the others and did the same, helping Luke, then Theo, then Philip. Bruno was already standing, watching it all with wide eyes. When everyone was back on their feet, Robert finally spoke the words that would change everything, that would redefine not just that moment, but the entire dynamic of the school. Robert said that knowing your own limits wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. He said that being able to brawl all day didn't make you stronger, that true strength came from control, from discipline, from choosing your battles. He said Michael had confused intimidation with respect, submission with admiration. He said that a true leader didn't need to force people to bow. They did it naturally because they recognized something in him worth following. Michael listened, really listened, for the first time since this impossible day had begun. His convictions were shaken, his worldview was cracking, but maybe, just maybe, something better could grow through those cracks. He asked, his voice low and defeated, if Robert thought he was better than him. Robert answered with brutal, simple honesty. No, I just know who I am. It was an answer that claimed no superiority, but acknowledged difference. Robert knew his limits, his skills, his purpose, and that certainty was what made him immovable when others wavered. Michael muttered something about luck, a last-ditch attempt to salvage some fragment of his ego. Robert smiled for the first time since he had arrived at the school. It was a small, almost sad smile, from someone who understood pride and how hard it was to let it go. He said that luck doesn't teach control, that Michael would understand that one day when he was ready to learn. And then, without waiting for more words, Robert walked to his backpack, picked it up from where it had been carefully placed before everything started, and began to walk toward the exit. The students in the windows watched in absolute silence as Robert Stone, drenched from head to toe but with that same unshakable dignity, walked across the back courtyard and disappeared beyond the gate. No one cheered, no one shouted. The moment was too big for that, too heavy with meaning. Something had changed that day at Northwood High. A hierarchy based on fear had fallen, and in its place, a new understanding was beginning to emerge. Michael remained in the courtyard long after Robert had gone, surrounded by his silent friends, all of them processing what had happened. Luke eventually turned off his phone, looking at the recording that could destroy Michael's reputation forever. But strangely, he felt no desire to share it. What had happened in that courtyard seemed too important to be reduced to a viral video, too personal to be turned into entertainment. He looked at Michael, saw something different in his eyes, something that looked like reflection, and silently deleted the video. In the days that followed, the story of the confrontation spread through the school, growing and changing with each retelling. Some said Robert had fought 10 people. Others said he was a professional boxing champion. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complex. Robert Stone was just an 18-year-old kid who had learned discipline through sport, who had chosen control over chaos, who had understood that true strength came from within, not from dominating others. Michael Carter changed too. Not overnight, not in some dramatic, movie-worthy transformation, but gradually in small steps. He stopped looking for fights. He started questioning why. He felt the need to dominate. He initiated conversations instead of confrontations. And while he and Robert never became close friends, he developed a genuine respect, the kind that comes from recognizing in another person something you aspire to be. Robert remained Robert. He went to his classes, he trained in the afternoons at the gym, he maintained his quiet discipline. He made friends eventually, people who appreciated his calm instead of feeling threatened by it. Julia became one of those friends, forever grateful to have witnessed the quiet courage he had shown from the very first day. And when other new students arrived, intimidated by the school's reputation, it was Robert who welcomed them, who taught them that respect was earned through character, not force. The back courtyard was cleaned up, the hose was put back in its cabinet, the puddles dried under the Chicago sun. But what had happened there remained, etched not in videos, but in the memories of all who had witnessed it or heard the story. It was a story about choices, about the kind of person you decide to be when tested, about the difference between power and control. And above all, it was a story about a boy named Robert Stone who on his first day at Northwood High taught everyone a lesson that books couldn't teach, that true strength has nothing to prove,